Welcome back to A People's Historian. I'm coming to you on location in beautiful Vallejo, California. We're at the site of the Mare Island Shipyards, which used to be actually for a few years it was the biggest shipyard in the country during the 60s when the shipyard and the uh, shipbuilding facilities were combined for a few years, but they got separated later. Uh, this was a military base. The base was closed officially in 1996 when President Clinton was closing bases to save with to balance the budget. Um, I'm standing before you before the SS LCS 102 historical ship here in Vallejo, and we are reading chapter 18 in People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, The Impossible Victory of Vietnam. Shall we dig in? Let's shall. The GI anti-war movement became more organized. Near Fort Jackson, South Carolina, the first GI coffee house was set up, a place where soldiers could get coffee and donuts, find anti-war literature, and talk freely with others. It was called the UFO and lasted for several years before it was declared a public nuisance and closed by court action. But other GI coffee houses sprang up in half a dozen other places across the country. An anti-war bookstore was opened near Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and another one at the Newport, Rhode Island Naval Base. Underground newspapers sprang up at military bases across the country. By 1970, more than 50 were circulating. Among them, About Face in Los Angeles, Fed Up in Tacoma, Washington, Short Times at Fort Jackson, Vietnam GI in Chicago, Graffiti in Heidelberg, Germany, Bragg Briefs in North Carolina, Fort Bragg, Last Harass at Fort Gordon, Georgia, Helping Hand at Mountain Home Air Base, Idaho. These newspapers printed anti-war articles, gave news about the harassment of GIs, and practical advice on the legal rights of servicemen, told how to resist military domination. Mixed with feeling against the war was resentment at the cruelty, the dehumanization of military life. In the army prisons, the stockades, this was especially true. In 1968, at the Presidio Stockade in California, which is pretty close to where I'm standing actually, well, not that close, it's in San Francisco, a guard shot to death an emotionally disturbed prisoner for walking away from a work detail. 27 prisoners then sat down and refused to work, singing "We Shall Overcome." They were court-martialed, found guilty of mutiny, and sentenced to terms of up to 14 years, later reduced after much public attention and protest. The dissidents spread to the war front itself when the Great Moratorium Day demonstrations were taking place in October 1969. That's when I was born. In the United States, some GIs in Vietnam wore black armbands to show their support. A news photographer reported that in a platoon on patrol near Da Nang, about half of the men were wearing black armbands. One soldier stationed at Chpt wrote to a friend on October 26, 1970, that separate companies had been set up for men refusing to go into the field to fight. It's no big thing here anymore to refuse to go. The French newspaper Le Monde reported that in 4 months, 109 soldiers of the 1st Air Cavalry Division were charged with refusal to fight. A common sight, the correspondent for Le Monde wrote, is the black soldier with his left fist clenched in defiance of a war he has never considered his own. Wallace Terry, a black American reporter for Time magazine, taped conversations with hundreds of black soldiers. He found bitterness against Army racism, disgust with the war, generally low morale, more and more cases of fragging were reported in Vietnam, incidents where servicemen rolled fragmentation bombs under the tents of officers who were ordering them into combat, or against whom they had other grievances. The Pentagon reported 209 fraggings in Vietnam in 1970 alone. By the way, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and that notification bell. YouTube may unsubscribe you. Veterans back from Vietnam formed a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. In December 1970, hundreds of them went to Detroit to what was called the Winter Soldier Investigations, nothing to do with Captain America, to testify publicly about atrocities they had participated in or seen in Vietnam, committed by Americans against Vietnamese. In April 1971, more than 1,000 of them went to Washington, D.C. to demonstrate against the war. One by one, they went up to a wire fence around the Capitol, threw over the fence the medals they had won in Vietnam, and made brief statements about the war, sometimes emotionally, sometimes in icy bitter calm. In the summer of 1970, 28 commissioned officers of the military, including some veterans of Vietnam, saying they represented about 250 other officers, announced formation of the Concerned Officers Movement Against the War. During the fierce bombings of Hanoi and Haiphong around Christmas 1972, came the first defiance of B-52 pilots who refused to fly those missions. On June 3, 1973, the New York Times reported dropouts among West Point cadets. Officials there, the reporter wrote, linked the rate to an affluent, less disciplined, skeptical, and questioning generation, and to the anti-military mood that a small radical minority and the Vietnam War had created. But most of the anti-war action came from ordinary GIs, and most of these came from lower income groups: white, black, Native American, Chinese, and Chicano. Chicanos back home were demonstrating by the thousands against the war. A 20-year-old New York City Chinese American named Sam Choi, enlisted at 17 in the Army, was sent to Vietnam, was made a cook, and found himself the target of abuse by fellow GIs, who called him chink and gook, the term for the Vietnamese, and said he looked like the enemy. One day he took a rifle and fired warning shots at his tormentors. By this time, I was near the perimeter of the base and was thinking of joining the Viet Cong. At least they would trust me, he said. Choi was taken by military police, beaten, court-martialed, sentenced to 18 months of hard labor at Fort Leavenworth. They beat me up every day like a time clock. He ended his interview with the New York Chinatown newspaper saying, "One thing, I want to tell all the Chinese kids that the Army made me sick. They made me so sick that I can't stand it." A dispatch from Phu Bai in April 1972 said that 50 GIs out of 142 men in the company refused to go on patrol, crying, "This isn't our war." The New York Times on July 4th, 1973 reported that American prisoners of war in Vietnam, ordered by officers in the POW camp to stop cooperating with the enemy, shouted back, "Who's the enemy?" They formed a peace committee in the camp, and a sergeant on the committee later recalled his march from capture to the POW camp. "Until we got to the first camp, we didn't see a village intact. They were all destroyed. I sat down and put myself in the middle and asked myself, is this right or wrong? Is it right to destroy villages? Is it right to kill people en masse?" After a while, it just got to me. Pentagon officials in Washington and Navy spokesmen in San Diego announced, after the United States withdrew its troops from Vietnam in 1973, that the Navy was going to purge itself of undesirables, and that these included as many as 6,000 men in the Pacific Fleet. a substantial proportion of them black. Altogether, about 700,000 GIs had received less than honorable discharges. In the year 1973, one of every 5 discharges was less than honorable, indicating something less than dutiful obedience to the military. By 1971, 177 out of every 1,000 American soldiers were listed as absent without leave, some of them 3 or 4 times. Deserters doubled from 47,000 in 1967 to 89,000 in 1971. One of those who stayed, fought, but then turned against the war was Ron Covich. His father worked in a supermarket on Long Island. In 1963, at the age of 17, he enlisted in the Marines. 2 years later in Vietnam, at the age of 19, his spine was shattered by shell fire. Paralyzed from the waist down, he was put in a wheelchair. Back in the States, he observed the brutal treatment of wounded veterans in the veterans hospitals, thought more and more about the war, and joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He went to demonstrations to speak against the war. One evening, he heard actor Donald Sutherland read from the post-World War I novel by Dalton Trumbo, Johnny Got His Gun, about a soldier whose limbs and face were shot away by gunfire. A thinking torso who invented a way of communicating with the outside world and then beat out a message so powerful it could not be heard without trembling. Sutherland began to read the passage, and something I will never forget swept over me. It was as if someone was speaking for everything I ever went through in the hospital. I began to shake, and I remember there were tears in my eyes. Covich demonstrated against the war and was arrested. He tells his story in Born on the 4th of July. They held me back into the chair and take me to another part of the prison building to be booked. "What's your name?" the officer behind the desk says. "Ron Covich," I say. "Occupation, Vietnam veteran against the war." "What?" he says sarcastically, looking down at me. "I'm a Vietnam veteran against the war." I almost shout back. "You should have died over there," he says. He turns to his assistant. "I'd like to take this guy and throw him off the roof." They fingerprint me and take my picture and put me in a cell. I have begun to wet my pants like a little baby. The tube is slipped out during my examination by the doctor. I try to fall asleep, but even though I am exhausted, the anger is alive in me like a huge hot stone in my chest. I lean my head up against the wall and listen to the toilets flush, again and again. Covich and the other veterans drove to Miami to the Republican National Convention in 1972, went into the convention hall, wheeled themselves down the aisles, and as Nixon began his acceptance speech, shouted, "Stop the bombing! Stop the war!" Delegates cursed them, "Traitor!" and Secret Service men hustled them out of the hall. In the fall of 1972, with no victory in sight, and North Vietnamese troops entrenched in various parts of the South, the United States agreed to accept a settlement that would withdraw American troops and leave the revolutionary troops where they were until a new elected government would be set up, including communist and non-communist elements. But the Saigon government refused to agree, and the United States decided to make one final attempt to bludgeon the North Vietnamese into submission. It sent waves of B-52s over Hanoi and Haiphong, destroying homes and hospitals, killing unknown numbers of civilians. The attack did not work. Many of the B-52s were shot down. There was angry protest all over the world, and Kissinger went back to Paris and signed very much the same peace agreement that had been agreed on before. The United States withdrew its forces, continuing to give aid to the Saigon government. But when the North Vietnamese launched attacks in early 1975 against the major cities in South Vietnam, the government collapsed. In late April 1975, North Vietnamese troops entered Saigon. The American embassy staff fled, along with many Vietnamese who feared communist rule, and the long war in Vietnam was over. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and both parts of Vietnam were unified as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Traditional history portrays the end of wars as coming from the initiatives of leaders. Negotiations in Paris, or Brussels, or Geneva, or Versailles, just as it often finds the coming of war a response to the demand of the people. The Vietnam War gave clear evidence that at least for that war, making one wonder about the others, the political leaders were the last to take steps to end the war. The people were far ahead. The president was always far behind. The Supreme Court silently turned away from cases challenging the constitutionality of the war. Congress was years behind public opinion. In the spring of 1971, syndicated columnists Roland Evans and Robert Novak, two firm supporters of the war, wrote regretfully of a sudden outbreak of anti-war emotionalism in the House of Representatives, and said the anti-war animosities, now suddenly so pervasive among House Democrats, are viewed by administration backers as less anti-Nixon than as a response to constituent pressures. It was only after the intervention in Cambodia ended, and only after the nationwide campus uproar over that invasion, that Congress passed a resolution declaring the American troops should not be sent into Cambodia without its approval. And it was not until late 1973, when American troops had finally been removed from Vietnam, that Congress passed a bill limiting the power of the president to make war without congressional consent. Even there, in that War Powers Resolution, the president could make war for 60 days on his own without a congressional declaration. The administration tried to persuade the American people that the war was ending because of its decision to negotiate a peace, not because it was losing the war, not because of the powerful anti-war movement in the United States, but the government's own secret memoranda all through the war testify to its sensitivity at each stage about public opinion in the United States and abroad. The data is in the Pentagon Papers. In June 1964, top American military and State Department officials, including Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, met in Honolulu. Rusk stated that public opinion on our SEA policy was badly divided and that therefore the president needed an affirmation of support. It's funny, there's quotations, but it doesn't say who's talking. Diem had been replaced by a general named Khan. Maybe that's who's talking. The Pentagon historians write, upon his return to Saigon on June 5th, Ambassador Lodge went straight from the airport to call on General Khan. The main thrust of his talk with Khan was to hint that the United States government would in the immediate future be preparing U.S. public opinions for actions against North Vietnam. 2 months later came the Gulf of Tonkin affair. On April 2nd, 1965, a memo from CIA Director John McCone suggested that the bombing of North Vietnam be increased because it was not sufficiently severe to change North Vietnam's policy. On the other hand, we can expect increasing pressure to stop the bombing from various elements of the American public, from the press, the United Nations, and world opinion. The U.S. should try for a fast knockout before the opinion could build up, McCone said. Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton's memo of early 1966 suggested destruction of locks and dams to create mass starvation, because strikes at population targets would create a counterproductive wave of revulsion abroad and at home. In May 1967, the Pentagon historians write, McNaughton was also very deeply concerned about the breadth and intensity of public unrest and dissatisfaction with the war, especially with young people, the underprivileged, the intelligentsia, and the women. McNaughton worried, will the move to call up 20,000 reserves polarized opinion to the extent that the doves in the United States will get out of hand, massive refusals to serve or to fight or to cooperate, or worse. He warned, there may be a limit beyond which many Americans and much of the world will not permit the United States to go. The picture of the world's greatest superpower killing or seriously injuring 1,000 non-combatants a week while trying to pound a tiny backward nation into submission on an issue whose merits are hotly disputed is not a pretty one. It could conceivably produce a costly distortion in the American national consciousness. Distortion. This costly distortion seems to have taken place by the spring of 1968 when, with the sudden and scary Tet offensive of the National Liberation Front, Westmoreland asked President Johnson to send him 200,000 more troops on top of the 525,000 already there. Johnson asked a small group of action officers in the Pentagon to advise him on this. They studied the situation and concluded that 200,000 troops would totally Americanize the war and would not strengthen the Saigon government because, and this is a quote, the Saigon leadership shows no sign of a willingness, let alone an ability, to attract the necessary loyalty or support of the people, unquote, end quote. Furthermore, the report said sending troops would mean mobilizing reserves, increasing the military budget. There would be more U.S. casualties, more taxes, and this growing disaffection accompanied, as it certainly will be, by increased defiance of the draft and growing unrest in the cities because of the belief that we are neglecting domestic problems, runs great risks of provoking a domestic crisis of unprecedented proportions. Neglecting domestic problems because of the military budget? Our government wouldn't do that, right? The growing unrest in the cities must have been a reference to the black uprisings that had taken place in 1967 and showed the link, whether blacks deliberately made it or not, between the war abroad and poverty at home. The evidence from the Pentagon Papers is clear that Johnson's decision in the spring of '68 to turn down Westmoreland's request to slow down for the first time the escalation of the war, to diminish the bombing, to go to the conference table, was influenced to a great extent by the actions Americans had taken in demonstrating their opposition to the war. When Nixon took office, he too tried to persuade the public that protest would not affect him, but he almost went berserk when one lone pacifist picketed the White House. The frenzy of Nixon's actions against dissidents, plans for burglaries, wiretapping, and mail openings suggest the importance of the anti-war movement in the minds of national leaders. One sign that the ideas of the anti-war movement had taken hold in the American public was that juries became more reluctant to convict anti-war protesters, and local judges too were treating them differently. In Washington, by 1971, judges were dismissing charges against demonstrators in cases where 2 years before they almost certainly would have been sent to jail. The anti-war groups who had raided draft boards, the Baltimore 4, the Catonsville 9, the Milwaukee 14, the Boston 5, and more, were receiving lighter sentences for the same crimes. The last group of draft board raiders, the Camden 28, were priests, nuns, and lay people who raided a draft board in Camden, New Jersey in August 1971. It was essentially what the Baltimore 4 had done 4 years earlier, when all were convicted and Phil Berrigan got 6 years in prison. But in this instance, the Camden defendants were acquitted by the jury on all counts. When the verdict was in, one of the jurors, a 53-year-old black taxi driver from Atlantic City named Samuel Brathwaite, who had spent 11 years in the Army, left a letter for the defendants. To you, the clerical physicians with your God-given talents, I say, well done. Well done for trying to heal the sick, irresponsible men who were chosen by the people to govern and lead them. These men who failed the people by raining death and destruction on a hapless country. You went out to do your part while your brothers remained in their ivory towers watching. And hopefully someday in the near future, peace and harmony may reign to people of all nations. That was in May 1973. The American troops were leaving Vietnam. C.L. Sulzberger, the New York Times correspondent, a man close to the government, wrote, "The U.S. emerges as the big loser, and history books must admit this. We lost the war in the Mississippi Valley, not the Mekong Valley. Successive American governments were never able to muster the necessary mass support at home. In fact, the United States had lost the war in both the Mekong Valley and the Mississippi Valley. It was the first clear defeat to the global American empire formed after World War II. It was administered by revolutionary peasants abroad and by an astonishing movement of protest at home." Back on September 26, 1969, President Richard Nixon, noting the growing anti-war activity all over the country, announced that under no circumstance will I be affected whatever by it. But 9 years later, in his memoirs, he admitted that the anti-war movement caused him to drop plans for an intensification of the war. Although publicly I continued to ignore the raging anti-war controversy, I knew, however, that after all the protests and the moratorium, American public opinion would be seriously divided by any military escalation of the war. It was a rare presidential admission of the power of public protest. From a long-range viewpoint, something perhaps even more important had happened. The rebellion at home was spreading beyond the issue of war in Vietnam. And that's it for Chapter 18. Thanks for joining me. Tune in next time for A People's Historian. Remember to hit that like and subscribe button and notification bell. And